Welcome back. I'm going to keep it as short as I can today. It's both a promise and a threat. My name is John Palmesino, and this is the last of the open seminar series Plan the Planet, which is inspired by the uneasy work of Jacqueline Territ. And this evening we are going to do two different things. We're going to, on one side, do a recapitulation of the argumentation for this inversion of planning when the Earthrise makes the Earth into an object of planning and mobilizes planning. And the complicated conditions we are facing today. This evening is a very cold evening, and I would like really to spend time trying to warm our hearts that there's a little bit of hope about what we can do. The argumentation is really one, and it has been from the outset, one of a transient condition from the Cold War to the Warm War. At the moment when the Berlin Wall came down, and with it all the regime of the East of Europe, everybody thought really that that was either the end of history or it was the moment when war as a condition of territorial condition just would fizzle out. We all know that we are in a forever war, and we would like to articulate the argument how to move away from the Cold War into the Warm War. In order to do that, I would like really to bring you back to a few of the elements that we've been discussing. This is a series that was sprung into being by an intimation by the students to rethink how we deal with climate in an architectural school, how we deal with the relationship and the uneasy relationship to the atmosphere, to the sky, and to the landforms that we inhabit, and the multiplicity of life that we are threatening, in both in the oceans and on land and the birds, insects, bacteria. We are in a climate crisis, even more so now that we can calculate exactly what that means after the amazing article that Tim Lenton published last Friday. I hope you've seen it all, together with John Schellhuber, Will Steffen, this amazing article in Nature recalling why the notion of tipping points is not just some scientific peripheral condition, and that, but how we can start thinking the relationship towards risk and the threat and an emergency in more clear ways. If you remember, those of you who had the opportunity to read this amazing article, we are in a climate emergency. We are in a climate emergency because the time that our actions might take form and start influencing the Earth system coincides with the time that remains for us to reach an unreversible tipping point of the Earth system. So this is the calculation, the mathematical calculation. There's no conditions more clear than that. No? The time that will take our actions to influence the Earth system if we start yesterday, and the time that remains, so to say, coincide. This is, of course, the condition that we describe during the series as the rise of the technosphere. The technosphere is a very young concept. It's a concept that somehow was thought of more than 100 years ago by Vernadsky. Vladimir Vernadsky was a Russian and then Soviet geologist who devised the beautiful word biosphere. And in his conception, there was a clear teleological movement from rocks, to the emergence of life, to the emergence of the biosphere, that is a complete different reorganization of the planet, to what he hoped would be a new condition of knowledge, the noosphere. In that very difficult concept that is really highly problematic on many levels, in particular the unification of the biosphere, and the fact that in spite of all his efforts, Vernadsky just treats life almost as an abiotic condition, a self-organizing system, but there's no real conditions of life in his description. In that concept, Peter Haff, one of the members of the Anthropocene working group, we've met a few of them over the series. In particular, we met Jan Salasiewicz, the convener of the working group. We met Davor Vidas. Peter Haff, a paleontologist, thought that the technosphere might be conceived as a spin-off of the biosphere. The technosphere is technically a very simple concept. It's everything that sustains human life. So all our bodies, plus the food we eat, so domesticated animals and plants, plus the energy systems that sustain us, and the information structures that sustain us. The technosphere has reached, in its material structures, the equivalent of any other paradigm of the Earth, like the lithosphere, the biosphere. So everything that we think we've produced ourselves, like cities, farmlands, plantations, transport structures, organization of information, the internet, summed up, are consuming as much energy as other forms of the Earth, other paradigms of the Earth. And this brings us to think that it is a self-organizing system that we are endeavoring to maintain rather than the other way around. So we are caught in this problematic of the technosphere. And this is a concept that I would like you to maybe put a little footnote to, because it's crucial for the argument that we are trying to highlight this evening, the argument towards climate peace. From within, we think we are in charge of everything we design. We can make the decision. We're in an emergency. We could take action. We got 30 years if everything goes according to plan to decarbonize our economies. And in the meantime, we think that everything is designed. Everything is pertaining the relationship between decision-making and material forms, interaction between people and things. From within, it all looks feasible. The technosphere has this difficult added element to it, that it's not recycling. Every other paradigm of Gaia, every other component, every other structure that configures Gaia constantly recycles. Actually, Gaia is better understood as a very complex series of asynchronous cycles that are recycling back energy and matter. The two main scientific paradigms that exit the Cold War are tectonic plate movements and greenhouse gas effects. It's an understanding that the Earth is dynamic. It's completely open. The technosphere doesn't recycle anything. On the contrary, we are producing a huge pile of refuse, and that we don't manage in any way to recycle. The major part of this is the part of the technosphere that is in the sky, the greenhouse gases that we've put in the sky. That is nothing else than a refuse, rubbish, so to say, that we don't manage to bring back into the different cycles of Gaia. Tim Lenton has, in his beautiful book, Revolutions That Made the World, this beautiful little diagram. It's really difficult to find. It's almost at the end of the book, among many other passages and probably graphically more beautiful charts. But basically, this is the problem of the technosphere as we see it today. And remember that Tim wrote this book more than 12 years ago. The atmosphere, the land, and the water of the oceans are in a dynamic system. It's highly unstable. The chemistry of the atmosphere is unstable. It is formed by gases that technically shouldn't be together. And the interaction with the land and with the oceans are more or less understood in what we call the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and so on. On the side, there is a leftover of fossils. And fossils are the beginning of geology. Fossils are nothing else than the carbon that is contained in life, in the biotic parts of Gaia, being fossilized, being transformed into very compact compound that has no oxygen in it. So instead of decomposing and being recycled into the land and into the atmosphere, somehow stays there. And all of that is more or less fine. We understand it. The moment that we start taking out the carbon fossils for our energy system, the James Watt was mentioned last week by both Alan Pottage and Davor Vidas as a very complex moment of the making of the relationship between the law and the Anthropocene. The moment that that energy contained in the carbon is released by our technological invention, something really strange happens. And that is the beginning of the rise of the technosphere. We augment our capacity to sustain ourselves. We augment our capacity to have food, to have transports, to have farms. Until then, the farms were basically run by the work of the animals. And we were feeding the animals some grass. There was maybe a little bit of wind here and there to help us with the pumping stations in order to give water to our fellow humans and our other animals, but that was it. The moment that we start and we move from one form of fire, just burning wood, into carbon, and then from carbon into gas, oil, and from there onwards with all the different forms of contemporary extraction of carbon fossil, the relationship between the atmosphere, the land, and the ocean change. And what happens is really the rise of the technosphere, this layer that covers the Earth. What happens is that half of the carbon is used in form of energy and remains in the once used in the form of energy, remains in the atmosphere. It doesn't come down. It doesn't dissolve into the ocean or is not captured back by plants. It just stays there and contributes to the augmentation of the greenhouse gases. The other half is divided more or less, and 25% goes into land and 25% goes into the ocean. When it goes into the ocean, it acidifies the ocean, it changes the life structures of the most important of our environments. And when it is on land, we're not quick enough to have more and more plants capture it. So what happens is that we have a huge pile of rubble, only of carbon, plus everything that we're moving with the energy that we are deriving from carbon. And let's remind ourselves that out of the 567 exajoules that humans use, and this is a figure of already 6 years ago, we've moved up, only a fraction, less than 1% is renewable energy. All the rest is carbon. We move all of this stuff, and that's the rise of the technosphere. I mention often that we have this little hobby of measuring how heavy it is. So this is the rough calculation that we've published a few years back. So if you imagine that 1 teraton is 10 to the 12 metric tons. So we are using a ton in terms of the metric ton. What we did was a very simple calculation of that thin layer. We're not calculating the carbon in the atmosphere, which you could imagine up to the year 2000 was something like 282 gigatons. We made a sum of all of these elements. Now we can go from the urban areas, rural housing, pasture land, cropland, trawled seafloor, land use, eroded soils, all the way to how heavy railways are in the world. And we look at the density. You can see it's a rough estimate. It's more or less. It's more or less than more in this situation. It's a conservative estimate. And we reach 30.11 teratons of stuff designed by architects, by engineers, in the civic enthusiasm of the 20th century. You could focus a little bit. No? Urban areas, of course, they are the heaviest because of the accumulation of mass in cities is much heavier than the thin layer over farmland or the trawled seafloor. There's not 1 square kilometer of the continental shelves that is not being trawled. And just so that we understand what we mean. Trawling is a gigantic metal cage, sometimes tens of meters large, that is thrown on the bottom of the sea and then dragged. Just dragged. If you remember, the equivalent that was discussed is that it is similar to have farming as if we would have gigantic machines cutting down all the trees, a huge upheaval of all land, destroying all the farms in order to find a few cows. This is something that was told to us on Friday by an amazing practitioner who's endeavoring to preserve marine areas. And you will destroy half of Britain only to find a few cows. Actually, we have destroyed more than half of Britain. We have destroyed an area that is the equivalent of continental Africa to find a few fish. And we destroyed all the habitats to find a few fish. So that's the level that we're discussing. No? The problem you start seeing in this proposition of ours to move from a negotiation on climate, like the one that is occurring today in COP, to a negotiation on peace, lies all in the fact that the technosphere, seen from without, so from its outset, is a self-organizing system. So, until now, all our negotiations are occurring as if we would be able to design our actions and in the relationship to the planet. Our proposition is to move away from that and seriously consider what it means to inhabit a world where at least 1/3 of the carbon is trapped by the technosphere. And we are self-organizing. And we are not really in control of this. We cannot stop it, we cannot augment it, we cannot reduce it. It's not recycling. The carbon that we have put into the atmosphere is not recycling back. It's not like in a forest where we are recycling back the organic compounds in very complex cycles. No? The technosphere just puts one more layer of rubble, one more layer of rubble. So the question for the negotiation on peace is really how to understand the cycles of the technosphere and make them somehow faster when they need to be faster, slower when they need to be slower. And this is one of the key elements of the proposition. You know, one of the difficulties is that when we start thinking of a different meter of articulation of, let's say, our architectures, our built environment, so to say, and we still think it as a given. The built environment is what surrounds us. We're not thinking it in terms of energy and material fluxes. We're not really imagining how the recycling of it, or how the relationship between the material structures of cities and what used to be called the countryside interact with the rest of the Earth system. So, fossil fuels, land, ocean, atmosphere. Proposition number one for a climate peace is to consider the technosphere in terms of its material, energy, and information cycles. And to start thinking that if we are serious about engaging with the contemporary climate emergency, we need to formalize negotiations about these cycles and how we inhabit these cycles. And this is, now I'll take a little time to explain how we can do this. And I'm going to show you an example. We shall need to keep oil in the ground. The Museum of Oil. This is a project that you might have heard bits and pieces from Charlie Cronick from Greenpeace when he was here on this very strange session where when we were asking, when are we? What is our time? When are we? And the Museum of Oil is for us a first step towards, let's say, an articulation of what we mean by a climate peace. It is primarily an understanding that if we don't have an energy transition, it's not an energy crisis, it's an energy crash. It's not an environmental crisis or an ecological crisis, it's extinction. So we need to keep oil in the ground, but we can't. Otherwise, my computer doesn't work, my microphone doesn't work, I cannot have water, I cannot travel here, my house is cold, the entire hospital system collapses, the police cannot control what we do, we cannot find food, most of our food comes from oil. Most of our food comes from oil, directly from oil. We use most of the carbon fossils. Most of our oil is used in refineries to transform it into fertilizers and to transform it into weed killers. And that sustains life for almost 6 billion people of us. It comes also indirectly from oil because we use a lot of oil in farming and most of farming are today completely automatized and so on, but we also use oil in order to go and troll and catch the fish in the high seas. Without oil, no food. So we cannot keep oil in the ground. Unless by a magic solution tomorrow some young kid invents a new form of energy. So we're stuck. We should need to keep oil in the ground, and we can't. That's the proposition of a negotiation. In order to keep oil in the ground, and we should keep oil in the ground, we need to completely revise our energies, our lifestyles, our economies, our institutions, or in other words, we shall need to revise territorial forms. We shall need to revise the relationship between how we organize ourselves in relationship, in connection to material flows, to energy flows, to biotic and abiotic flows, to information flows. And this is where the proposition becomes not one of activism, so to say, of fighting in the streets, but one of design. The proposition of a climate peace is one where whereby we need to negotiate, or we would need to negotiate, a new relationship, literally a new relationship to the ground. But a ground that is no longer the one that we have discovered so far, but it's one of murky oil. It's one where it's almost impossible to distinguish what is keeping us alive and what kills us. Where the invisibility of this oil violence needs to be made explicit, needs to be made not a ghost, needs to be brought at the table of negotiation. And so what we need to do is to clearly delineate territories that are being shaped directly by oil and clearly delineate how we can extract ourselves from them, oil. So it's both a situation of ground, it's a situation of soil, it's a situation of enriching the biosphere, enriching possibilities of recycling, of using more energy from the planet without us putting the refuse of carbon, having well in mind that what we're living in is a gigantic ruin, because the carbon that is in the atmosphere is going to be there for at least 300,000 years. The structures that we built in the, on land and the vessels that we pushed at sea have established themselves as a gigantic ruin. The structures that are somehow still cycling in and out of the earth are damaging so much life in the form of pollution, acidification, reduction of ecosystems, reduction of conditions of possibility of expansion of many of the livelihoods. And as we do this delineation, we need to negotiate these territories. Not only, as we discussed with Lucia Pietroiusti, with humans, but with human, non-human, post-human entities. We need to renegotiate our position among these territories. And hopefully, we can use what is left of architecture after we go through all of this process of sorting out what we should actually teach in a school, sort of mass destruction of the planet, or what? What is left of architecture is a capacity of being convivial, of hospitable, being carrying hospitality. I think that is really, if there is one element that we should carry on of this amazing thing we call architecture, is that capacity of thinking that actually we can form homes. Not houses, homes. We can create conditions where existence would be acceptable. This is a version of the Museum of Oil that was displayed in the town of Karlsruhe in Germany. And the point is that as you set out to do this negotiation, they have to be in public. It has to be a public, formal negotiation. Otherwise, the energy transitions won't occur. Since, I checked the other day, since we started the Museum of Oil, we've put more carbon in the atmosphere than we did in the 10 years before. There's all these talks about energy transitions, renewables, and in particular how cities are at the forefront of the political capacity of driving the energy transition. It would be nice. It would be really nice, but not really. It's not happening. So the question is, why is it not happening? What is it that holds us back? Is it that we don't know? Since we know about climate change, we've more than doubled emissions. So we do know, but we don't do anything. Why? And this is the question that is puzzling, and it's really, for us, an important one, because we really think that the difficulty is that we still inhabit what Charlie was discussing as the deficit condition of activism. There's a deficit in your knowledge. If only you would know and feel what I feel, you will be good. That's why we're not acting, because we think that we're in a deficit. We don't think that we are actually in a situation where we do know what's going on. And this is the difficult part, knowledge. The difficult part has to do with the fact that we still rely on the fact that either we have full knowledge in order to act, or we wouldn't act. That we are not ready to act without full, approved, and certified knowledge of the consequences of our actions. So we need the input of science. But science is only slightly sure of what they're saying about our Earth. Hence, it's not a fact. We'll wait. This is a very strange deferral to a notion of knowledge, of action. We need to act only when we will know. Not understanding that architecture, for instance, doesn't act when you know. On the contrary, we imagine things, and we operate through imagination, not by knowledge. Oh, I know that this will do that. So there's a very strange phenomenon that we are encountering in the contemporary negotiation on climate change, that more and more solutions are visible, but they're not sustained by polities. There's no political backing for them, because the polities are still waiting for the facts. And of course, they're not going to be told to change their lives by people who have no understanding of what they're doing, until it's certain and certified. And then the question is, certified by whom? By some Chinese hoax. You'll start seeing that the problem of knowledge and action is really crucial. So the proposition of climate peace is that we don't need knowledge to act. What we need is to act for peace, in order not to kill each other. Exactly like in the 16th century in Britain, the separation of science and politics was established in order to have peace. On one side, there will be clear facts, and on the other side, there will be the body politic that will act on facts. And one is experimental, the other one is completely organized through pure mathematical logics of the Hobbesian polity. That distinction is today, again, for peaceful reasons, needing to be recomposed. That distinction of the body politic from the science needs to be reshuffled. Politics, how the world ought to be, or should be, and science, how the world is, need to be completely remixed. We have to start understanding the political dimension of science making. We have to understand the scientific dimension of political conditions. And those distinctions should be surpassed very quickly. In order to do this, we propose that a negotiation on peace, rather than on climate, would, in particular if it would be formalized, would quickly allow us to debate something like this. Very complex numerical models of pathways to energy transitions. Our 30 years. How do we even start thinking that by 2030 we'll have 1/5 of our energy only coming from oil? How do we do that? How do we organize the political will? How do we organize that solution or set of solutions that we have with a set of imaginations from architecture that could somehow bring us there? And this is the moment where we really think that the difficulty that we are facing is somehow to be articulated. So, if we take one of those scenarios on how we could transition from current situation of overexposure to oil. We are like addicts, oil addicts. How, and if we will continue with existing structures, the existing and new fields that we already have, you start seeing that we will be around 40 billion barrels of oil by 2050. What we have already committed ourselves financially is bringing us to a condition that is untenable in the near and the medium-term future. Because if we are to reach the different agreements of 1.5 or 2% and 2 degrees centigrade, we have to do that rapid curve down. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we go downhill when we have already committed all our finances to exploit the oil? You see that there is a problem here that is war. If we are serious about an energy transition, we have to be serious about understanding the conditions for which oil and carbon-based fuels engender war. They engender war through the formation of specific territories on the ground that secure the supply chain in all its aspects, both juridically, with the entire apparatus that we've described with Davor Vidas, the exclusive economic zones on the continental shelf, all the way to conditions of securitization and militarization of choke points and the imagination of the inhabited spaces around the oil reserves as being extremely dangerous, so that we need to make them go in and secure them. You need to first imagine that a city like Lagos is extremely dangerous in order to then simplify it. It's too dangerous because it's too complicated. So you go in and you simplify it. And how do you simplify it? You simplify it through contemporary architecture, through compounds, through separation of people. The same thing happens in the wonderful cities that shaped the beginning of the Holocene in the Fertile Crescent. Suddenly Baghdad is no longer the Baghdad with pendant gardens. It's the Baghdad that needs to be bombed because it's insecure. So there's an architecture of simplification that is occurring around oil that is impeding us from understanding how to get out of that. Again, a question of peace. So the proposition is really to think of territories, to think of the geosemantic condition that allow us to warn others from entering and impounding on what keeps us alive, and to outline these territories. And they're no longer the territories of the 20th century and the 19th century extended formation of the nation states, but they are cyclic bases. They are Gaia territories, where our territories related to the stratosphere, to the cirrus clouds in the stratosphere that maintain and regulate the homeostasis of the planet. There are territories that relate to the washing off of the water from the shelves of the continent into the abyss. We are relating to the phosphorus cycles of food and so on, and nitrogen. It's better that we don't start thinking of NOx. When we imagine an energy transition, what many people start thinking is self-sufficiency. We'll be self-sufficient. We'll be completely independent energetically. And you start thinking of the dream of a condition where you're not going to be relating to other conditions, and you'll be completely self-organized, almost in a revival of the 1920s and 30s, where the fascist states will imagine that they will be completely organizing in autonomy. The United States had that thought around 15 years ago with what came to be known as the shale boom. The shale gas and the fracking boom became nothing else than the materialization of this dream of independence. If only the Americans would be able to extract from the shale rocks the gas and the oil that is making the United States so rich, they will no longer depend on the Middle East, on Nigeria, on Brazil, on Venezuela, on Canada, on Russia, to be the most powerful nation on the planet. It's a very simple calculation. If only you will be able to have all of the oil, you can withdraw. The interesting thing is that once you start analyzing the territory of that shale boom, you start understanding that the price, of course, starts dropping, but the actual condition of the, say, break-even prices of the shale starts showing that the very minute operations of the fracking, and we're not even talking about how it destroys the livelihood by poisoning the groundwater. But you can imagine that each one of those white dots is an independent fracking station. It just pops up, and it takes out the gas, and then goes away, and moves on and on and on. It's nothing. It's 200 meters by 200 meters. Every single one of them is related in the imaginary to self-sufficiency. In reality, it's related to a very complex set of geopolitical operations that span the entire surface of the planet in relationship to the price of oil, in particular to the break-even price of oil. So suddenly you start seeing that, first of all, the shale gas never brings the energy that's promised, but what it does is that it generates a transition to low prices of oil that then make a lot of the fields completely untenable. A lot of the economies that were previously based on oil become more unstable. So what you thought, the dream of independence, creates more and more instability. And that is energy independence that is based on oil. If you're thinking of an energy independence based on renewables, how are we going to organize the break-even price? We haven't even started thinking of the break-even price of our energy transitions. We start maybe seeing how we need to re-articulate these territories. We need to re-articulate territories that sustain our livelihood, our capacity of living together in a peaceful way, out of the warm war, away from the pre-established notions of locality. And we can start looking at the Arctic Russia with a huge problem of a collapse in infrastructure that was set up by the Soviet, and now it's spilling more oil in the rivers of the Arctic than it is actually managing to carry to the urbanized areas. We can look at West Africa with $380 billion lost from the extraction. Nigeria could be the richest country in the world, richer than the Saudis. It's not. Where's the money? The money went into mobilizing that architecture of simplification. You needed that money to simplify the architecture of Nigeria. It's too complicated. Look, it's chaotic. We need to go in and secure it. All of the money goes straight to the military system. And the rapid urbanization to the coast, driven by the prospect of wealth and prosperity because of oil, is stranded in this very complicated relationship of no $380 billion. Where are they? Many people call it corruption. Another dream of energy sufficiency, Canada, the peaceful Canada. The most peaceful place on earth, Canada. It gives more passports than anybody else in the world. No? It's there for everybody who's wishing to move away from a crisis, gives you refuge. And, So the boreal forest of Canada is completely destroyed in the quest of trying to extract this tar from its surface. Tar. Actually, tar sands, oil sands. Oil that is mixed with sand, and you scrape it in order to then try to clean it up. And in the process, use more energy than you would actually need to recuperate from the final product. And you think that this, of course, is a climate crime. And I agree with our friends at Greenpeace, that is a climate crime. But the difficult part is really that Athabasca tar sands, and here's one of our analyses on the multi-year development, and you see the explosion. Everything that is blue was not there 5 years before. Now it's poof, explosion. But the problem is that the tar sands, the single largest operation on the planet, the single largest industrial operation on the planet, it's just a fraction of what's going on. That little grayish speck, 2/3 of the image up, a little bit to the right of the center, are the tar sands. Everything that is in the boreal forest is destroyed by the prospecting of oil, of the tar sands. The cuts through the forest in order to drive jeeps to sound the ground in order to understand where to extract. I've cut so many trees, so many elements across the boreal forest that everything is destroyed. These lines. Just to give you an example. The width of that central line is 20 meters. Butterflies don't migrate, trees don't move, foxes and wolves, predators can roam those alleys in the forest. The entire ecology of Canada has been mutated by oil. So the distance between those two pads is more or less 1.5 kilometers. And the thing goes on and 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 on, everywhere. What I just showed you on the initial panel, on that panel, it's just one of those lines. There's hundreds of thousands of them in the quiet of the forest. In order to get images like this, that the geologist will interpret in order to understand the depth at which we can extract the oil. Oh, the Gulf of Mexico, of course, with the beautiful and flourishing delta of the Mississippi. One of the largest deltas in the world, that is at the same time the area that is disappearing, is vanishing faster than anywhere else on the planet. It's vanishing so fast, the delta is sinking. But it's one of the most beautiful places on Earth. And of course, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Of course, the entire system of destruction related to the oil in the delta. But mainly the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, this gigantic atrophic area that the delta somehow flushes into the Gulf of Mexico waters from the basin of the Mississippi in order to maintain and sustain the great plains of agriculture, in particular corn agriculture of the United States. You need to push more and more fertilizers, fertilizers that then wash straight into the river system without soil retaining structures. Farmlands goes from rotation of crops to unified crops. The structure of soil are then immediately pushed into the waters of the Mississippi Canal, which drains all of this into the very complex and beautiful areas of the delta, and once it reaches there, there's too many nutrients. And when there's too many nutrients in the water flourishes with vegetation. But vegetation is seasonal. And when vegetation dies at the end of the season, it goes on the bottom of the sea. And when it rots, it sucks away all the oxygen from water and kills everything. So you see the paradox. We're putting too much food into the water. Hence, life in water dies. That's oil. Or we could start looking at the more urban structures. How to imagine Chicago? I'm saying this to our friends at NDIP4. How do you imagine every bit of that beautiful architectural city built? One bit after the other, out of oil, without having in mind the refineries, without having in mind the movement of ground and movement of the structures of that make a city. That Chicago today is the seat of operations of the largest BP refinery in the world, that refines the heavy oil from the tar forests. You need to build pipelines, of course, to bring oil from Canada to Chicago. And the pipelines go across indigenous lands. And they spill oil when they're built. After the lack of negotiation on where to build them, they spill oil. Actually, you spill oil also without the pipeline, because in America, we've noticed it very clearly. Majority of oil and gas is transported on railway. So the question that we are trying to pose today as we close the series on Plan the Planet is one of negotiations. It's a very difficult set of negotiations that we need to have if we are to have a climate peace. It's a negotiation that needs to have in mind that the territory is going to be open on all sides. We're going to have intrusions from all sides. The intrusion is a key element. A territorial structure needs to be negotiated in terms of cycles, not of space. It needs to be negotiated, and a negotiation is nothing else than the reconfiguration of a polity, of the reconfiguration of a material set of relations between people, institutions, plants, animals, processes of erosion, cycles of the atmosphere. We need to renegotiate our forms of polities. our structures of inhabitation. And a difficulty added to this is that peace can no longer be thought as the pacifier, as the place of stability. Peace is not the peace on earth that of Marxism, of the environmental movement, is not this idea of a goodwill that will enable a good-spirited mind to prosper. But peace is a condition of complete disengagement from that idea of being good. It's a climate peace. It's a condition where the distinction between the world of necessity and the world of freedom needs to be completely reshaped and reshuffled. So it's a piece of uncertainty. The uncertainties are also to be, so to say, rediscovered. They're not the uncertainties of the stock market. They're not the uncertainties that have been transformed by people like Milton Friedman from the unknowable market of Hayek into the knowable idea of calculation of the uncertain condition of the market. It's not what drives derivatives. It's a condition of deep uncertainty whether there is a future. There's an uncertainty that is not about what we know or what we don't know. It's whether, in spite of what we know and what we don't know, whether there is a future at all. So caution, a precautionary system is to be reinvented. Just a few notes to conclude the series, I would say. All of this has been thought from the sea. Apparently, the sea is the area of the planet that is the most removed from architecture. It's the area of the planet that somehow we can only imagine as the source of life, primordial life, the beautiful coral reefs. But if we are serious about renegotiation of the conditions of inhabitation, we really think as territorial agents that we need to start from the sea. We need to start thinking that the conditions of separation between land and sea, whereby you still imagine us as being a terrestrial form, everything needs to be reorganized around us standing up, need to be undone. Now we need to start thinking the dismissal of contemporary forms of capitalism, the dismissal of contemporary forms of sovereignty, the dismissal of contemporary forms of say enrichment, and even of contemporary forms of negotiation, as if they would be stable on a stable ground. We need to be at sea, where there's no possibility of stability. There's no possibility of imagining a fixed point. We need to constantly engage with looking out for the others, looking out for the waves, for the depth, for the animals, for other humans, for other vessels. We need to be alert in thinking climate peace. And this is where it becomes really interesting. Because you think that the sea is just this other space. Yeah, it is dynamic, there are a lot of waves and so on. But the interesting element about the rise of the technosphere is that even the sea level rise is undergoing a transformation. The level of the sea could very easily, if we're not careful, change by 7 meters in 30 years. one of the tipping points of our planet is the Greenlandic ice shelf. It could surpass the tipping point within 30 years. And if that happens, you can add 7 meters to the forecast of the IPCC. You can add maybe another 3 meters to the forecast of the IPCC a little bit further down the line if the Antarctic, West Antarctic and East Antarctic start catastrophic meltdown. It has happened before. The proposition of a climate peace negotiation is to start from the sea, to start thinking renegotiations on unstable ground across territories of inhabitation, and in order to arrive to a climate peace, not the perpetual peace of Kant. Thank you. We have time for coming at the table and asking questions, comments and feedback, please.
Hi, very fascinating. I found the last part especially fascinating. So I have 2 questions actually. The first part regarding the one that you talked about, the definition of peace, and how you mentioned, I didn't catch the first, I just wish if you can elaborate a bit more about how it's a complete disengagement and also how it's relating to the notion of uncertainty on that aspect.
Yeah. On many levels, the 20th century is really the century where we change. Instead of peace, we have security. And peace has been sort of expelled from our public thoughts, except, like we said last week, every Miss Universe wants to have peace on Earth. It's that level of wishful thinking, that everybody looks down a little bit at. You cannot seriously think that. You cannot be someone smart if you want peace on Earth. If you would like security, that would be great. That's the usual kind of discussion. The people, but the point is that a peace negotiation happens usually at the end of a conflict, or it happens to prevent a conflict. So, what we are describing here is a formalized negotiation of peace. So, in a peace negotiation, you need to make sure that everyone will be at peace. So it's not a condition where the person who wins the war and the person who lost the war somehow negotiate repairments, but they have to negotiate how not to have war. And that makes, until now, the negotiation one of fixity. You will have to do this. I will have to do this. Or you distribute roles. And you distribute roles in the hope that the roles will be so clearly defined as power equity that it will be impossible to think of war. So you want to avoid a disequality in power. That's the current situation. So you want clarity. And you want to be clear that no side will be more powerful than the other in a peace negotiation. Of course, this is the difficult part, because of course you have the people who won the war. Or if you are still at war, you have those who think that they can win the war. So you have to negotiate completely out of that structure. But the uncertainty that we are proposing is the fact that we cannot seriously say, you stay there, and you stay there, and that's your land, and that's your land, and you're divided, and you're not going to fight. Because the land where you're going to be reallocated is unstable. It's probably not only unstable, but it's acting more fast than what any one of us can act. The Earth is unstable. So the proposition is to then think of this most untenable of conditions, that of being neutral, as the proposition of maintenance of a climate peace.
So it's almost like getting rid of the thought of like land ownership or something that has been established will last forever.
No. We have to have land ownership.
Okay.
We cannot give up land ownership. That will not be peaceful.
So you think that's something related to the basis of peace?
But I would like to distinguish ownership from use.
Yeah.
I would like to make a clear-cut distinction between also different forms of use. There's multiple forms of use. There's all the way from exclusive use to usus fructus, or even just roaming. And at the moment, we don't have institutions that think of sovereignty beyond the notion of complete ownership, exclusive ownership. So the proposition of going from a spatial organization to a cyclical one, I think, will allow us to open up that aspect. Does it make sense?
Yeah. It's like less linear, but more focused on the cyclical aspect.
But with a clear goal. Peace in 30 years.
Can I ask another question? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, just wonder, because for the notion how we see ocean or sea is clearly tied up with the land and as something that can be controlled, is that something like pretty recent, as you mentioned, like something that comes up as the 20th century notion, or I just wonder, like, in your understanding, when does this kind of, like, human can control the ocean, like, this kind of ideas that first emerges out of the, I would say, like, collective consciousness of the mankind, like, the first appearance in history?
Where we can control the ocean.
Yeah, like...
It goes back a long time, but there's a particular case, I think it was mentioned also last week, by the International Court of Justice, which is one of the bodies of the United Nations, where a case between Germany and Denmark was about who is entitled to extraction of gas from the sea, what we call the North Sea. It used to be called the German Sea, but that's another story. Whether who's entitled to that, and the problem of the sentence of the International Court of Justice is that it describes a condition ipso facto of availability of the resources to the coastal state. That means that there's no other legal or juridical or institutional or political provision that needs, or even technical provision that needs to be put in place for the coastal state to exert exclusive rights on the sea. That's what I understand controlling the sea. But we know that we cannot control the sea. We cannot control its waves, we cannot control its swelling, its melting, and that, forget about it. But we are, on many levels, we are influencing it. But it's out of our control. There's two questions.
I'd like to talk to you, or I'd like to make a point about soil and food production. It's obviously an incredibly interesting subject. And I'd like to make one or two very simple points. Before the agricultural revolution, farming did not rely on the oil industry. It was perfectly efficient at using a recycled system. Animal dung was, all animal but dung was extremely valuable. Ploughing was really introduced relatively recently. Before that, the plough didn't basically rip the surface of the earth. The significance of that is that the worms and the microbiotic life, which is in that top surface, was incredibly valuable to the production of foods. Then with the Industrial Revolution, so that was eclipsed with the Agricultural Revolution. What is really interesting is that if you look at a slide, a microbiotic slide of amoeba, microzoa, and fungi, you can see all these tiny creatures being extremely active in the soil. And there's only 2 laboratories in Europe which have got a laboratory like this, and I went to one 2 weeks ago. And what it made me realize, in a sort of Zen-like way, that we have lost completely one's understanding of the soil and the significance of the soil. Because the agrochemical industry have basically financed universities, professors, and students. And the research is done not into free amoeba. The research is done into how can you produce more crops, et cetera, with fertilizers. And what is really fascinating is that if you read about work which was done in the 50s and 60s by using the natural old-fashioned systems, that in Australia, which is now devastated by drought, by using sort of medieval systems of fertilizer, etc., in Australia you can grow crops. It takes about 2 years or 3 years. You can grow crops under conditions which, if the trial situation, have a crop there and then a normal crop. When there's a drought or when there's insects, as it were, the modern technology suffers far more than the traditional system. And basically, what is true, that crops grown under the traditional system using the microbiological world, crops produce a tomato which was produced in 1950 in the UK, is 10 times as nutritious as a tomato which is grown under modern fertilizers, etc. So, and essentially, to divorce agriculture from the petrochemical industry, it's relatively straightforward if we all understood the relevance of this micro world. And it was interesting that Leonardo da Vinci, whenever Leonardo da Vinci was writing, he said, we know more about the celestial sphere than the ground underneath us. That's all.
Thank you very much. I got here some notes. In 1825, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were 1 billion. In 1927, it took us 100 years to become 2. Then we doubled in 75 years. And then we added another 2 billion in 20 years. So, from 1 to 2 to 4 to 6 billion, it's uprise curve. It's not a linear equation. It's really a rapid acceleration. And that has to do with the fact that if calculations are correct, more or less 10 exajoules have been added to the agricultural produce by oil. And you're right, there are ways through which we could grow forests without a single moment of fertilizing, by understanding the relationship between soil and the plants and the organization of their cycles and understanding the entire structure of the canopy, what goes above, what goes beneath. And we could have amazing forestry reconstruction. And there are plenty of examples. I can afterwards maybe point you to some of the work of a Swiss farmer operating in the Amazon, and a good friend of the artist Ernesto Neto, and how the forestry has been completely transformed by many of these practices. And I think that you're equally right in indicating that the 20th century is really the epoch of an intrusion of the oil industry into our knowledge system. Into the structure of the farms, into the structure of the agrarian universities and faculties, all the way into architecture. I really would like to find one department of architecture that can explain insulation without reverting to oil-based materials, just to indicate a few of the elements. But I also think that there are, and you're right in indicating that there's a possibility through agriculture, innovation, or better, old agriculture, the old knowledge of the Holocene. I think you're right in indicating that there is a real chance to maintain the level of nutrition, both in terms of the vegetables, but also proteins for our current population. And
just as a point of historical fact, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've been here before though. I mean, Marx was writing about this very point and what happened in agriculture in this country in the 1860s or 1880s. I can't remember it precisely. When he realized that, in fact, the rapid, let's call it industrialization of agricultural production was depleting soil fertility, which meant they had to import guano, right, from colonies, and then they depleted all of the guano from Chile and other countries in Latin America. And that led them to discover nitrates, which led into fertilizers, which led into the beginning of these other extractive processes. So this has been going on. A connection to crisis and soil fertility has been long established. It's one of those histories, though, that we somehow would prefer to either not remember for some other reason. And I think those links are fundamental in terms of what the carrying capacity, if we use that term in a Gaia sense, is, how we measure it systemically, and how carrying capacity becomes a fundamental coordinate with which we navigate this climate peace you propose.
the question is exactly that. We know the solution. We don't need to reinvent anything. We know this. But there's no solution until there's a polity behind that solution. Otherwise it's just a wish. It's not a solution, it's a wish. At the moment we have a lot of wishes. And that's why we really think that the idea of a series of formalized negotiation will then bring up the dark histories of, for instance, of the complete eradication from Europe of peasantry. No? What used to be the rural culture of Europe, gone. Nobody's a peasant in Europe. What happened to that culture? What happened to that civilization? For instance, what happened to the long established conditions of inhabitation of the land? Now, when we talk about the technosphere being 30 trillion tons, one of the elements that is astonishing is that if you would be serious about being an archaeologist of the 21st century, is that you're looking at basically always the same structures, no matter where you are. No, you can be in California, in Chile, in Europe, north of Europe, south of Europe, Asia, Africa. No matter where you are, the contemporary production is always the same. Our buildings look the same everywhere. But they used to be so different because there used to be such a clarity in the way through which humans interacted with available means around them. But we're not advocating to return to that. Because there's something that has happened in between, and that is really the intrusion of Gaia. No matter how fascinated we are from early societies, they had no experience on how to deal with a planetary scale phenomenon like the one we are in. So we have to, at the same time, acknowledge their capacity, acknowledge their long suffering, the long-term violence, the silent violence of these processes, and understand that they are not the solution. So I do agree with pushing further capacity of fostering the ground and the soil and its relationship, but not by returning to that condition. I think this is the real difficulty. No? The negotiation has to happen so quick, and we have to invent everything anew so quick. And it's a gigantic project for architecture. But it cannot be thought in extension like we've been thinking so far, or through the gridded separation of agriculture and the city like we've been thinking through the explosion of our favorite material, barbed wire.
But in terms of the soil, for example, if you have the power of the agrochemical companies still there, they will, I would assume, block any exploration of reverting back to understanding the microbiotic world, because it's against their financial interests. I mean, certainly that's what happened in the past, and I can't see how it's not going to.
There are some. There's a particular group of geoscientists that are extremely interested in that. This is really not my work or our work, but we are only slightly connected to this. The entire establishment of the network of the critical zone observatories, where the soil, as you say, becomes the central part, not only of agrarian practices, but opens up all kinds of questions about Gaia, all kinds of questions about the relationship between formation of soil and transformation of the lithosphere and transformation of the atmosphere. All of that is a new science that has to do really with all the elements, this microbiotic condition, and at the same time thinking of the entire planet. That is an area that is of enormous potential. And with the help of some of our friends, you start seeing how it has also an enormous political potential in decentering polities, in re-establishing relationships. And maybe the petrochemical industry, it's far more fragile than we think. It has spread so far, and it is an untenable industry. Untenable. It is a zombie. So we should stop it. No? There was another question behind you, I think.
So I come from a more human geography, anthropology background, so I apologize to the rest of the room if this may be a bit self-evident. So my question is a bit more applied. My question is more about how do architects and urban planners, how can they and how do they engage dynamically in these negotiations around climate peace? whether that's in partnerships or in specific projects or research. Yeah, that's my question.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be nice if they would, but it's. I think that from an anthropological point of view, there are two things to keep in mind. The way in which architecture over the last 40 years has engaged itself in thinking communities, and at the same time minimizing their role. If you could find that in a lot of anthropological fieldwork, looking at architects. And when we conduct community initiatives, basically what happens is that an architect goes into a meeting, puts up some post-it notes, asks the community to engage with them, and doesn't care really about the quiet people at the end of the room, because those are not going to be influencing the planning process. Then collects all of these post-its, makes a little resume, puts it into the planning notes, and moves on. That's the level of and the paucity of thinking society that architecture has engaged with at the moment. No, it's a scandal. But there are another, I think, more interesting condition of about anthropology and architecture, and that is that for some bizarre reason, which are imperscrutable, I really cannot understand any reason why, architects give up their anthropological power. If you speak to many of the architects, especially the young ones, they will say, I'm powerless, there's no agency, there's nothing we can do. Someone who's actually, I'm not gonna mention anything about our colleagues, but the power of people sitting around the table concocting the plan, I think, is really to be upheld. Architects still have a lot of anthropological power. When a group of architects arrive in a place with a plan, hey, something is happening. And we simultaneously don't recognize the violence that many of our colleagues are doing, and don't recognize the power that we carry. So maybe that's not the field of fieldwork that already exists, but the fieldwork that I would like to see is what happens then, if there is that power. You know? And I don't know many of the projects that have been looking at this.
Actually, this lack of user feedback in architecture, the lack of prototyping for communities and getting feedback at initial stages of projects is a parallel that happens in a lot of development projects.
Yeah, of course.
And it's actually the same in all forms of global governance when you're designing new policies.
Yeah, but with the entire rhetorics that has come attached with architecture, this lady that we always show at the end of our seminars, Jacqueline Turret, invented the entire idea of feedback in architecture. Actually, she invented the entire notion of feedback. And the idea was really to build communities and so on. And actually, when you are serious about architecture, you know very well that you cannot design in a committee. It doesn't work. If you look at other attempts through which there's I think that what you're describing is an idea that architects put forward plans or constructions that are too rigid to be then adapted and modified to have feedback on their functioning. Actually, the entire notion of feedback in that case was developed in conjunction by architects, sociologists, anthropologists, and so on. So I'm not so sure that we are lacking the feedback mechanism even in development projects. Actually, I think that the entire structure is built in from the beginning in order to have it only under certain circumstances. If you look at the work of Margaret Mead in relationship to Jacqueline Turret, you will discover all kinds of very strange relationships about the entire idea of embedded intelligence. Very strange situation.
Should I ask one more?
Josh, go ahead.
Okay. I really enjoyed when you were talking about the reintegration of politics and science as this sort of main challenge of, let's say, negotiating with the technosphere. And I thought I had read before that James Lovelock proposed nuclear power as the solution to the energy transition. And it seemed like this sort of low-hanging fruit in his mind, somebody who obviously understood the planetary entanglements of, our kind of current situation. So how do you bring somebody like Lovelock, or how do you bring a community of scientists into a space of negotiation when the sort of technological fix is so before us? Even if you look at how the market reacts to climate change, like we have some of the largest, most powerful stocks this year are related to, let's say, meatless protein or electric cars, and we see this momentum. But do you think that negotiation should be weighted more than technology? And
negotiation is not what happens like this country thinks as a business negotiation. It's not that kind of negotiation that I'm discussing. Science is already in negotiation. The article of Tim was here a few weeks ago, in Nature, is written with John Shenhuber. And I don't know any scientist more powerful than John Shenhuber. No? He defines what climate negotiations are. He's the most powerful scientist. He's also written in collaboration with Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Center. Again, directly a scientist shaping politics. So that is already happening. The point is that is the way through which we organize the collaboration between science and politics that is not happening. It's not that science is not informing politics. It's already been, but it's the relationship between a fact and then decisions on the fact that needs to be completely reshaped. We need to understand that exactly in the same way as facts in science are built through a very complex set of negotiation, institutional relation, and exactly because of that they are resilient. They have a strength because they're built with such difficulty. If only we'll have the similar structures in political fields, then we will be, I think, a little bit off better. The question then of technology, I think that is included in that, and the question of Lovelock is very interesting, because the technological means are in relationship to the technosphere very strange, because we cannot be serious about starting the recycling of the technosphere if we think that we simply add technology. If the solution to climate change is to add more technology, we are missing the point. So the question is not to add technology that is green and beautiful Tesla Cybertruck and so on, but it's quite cool actually. But the question is, how do you recycle? How do you recycle at the level of the technosphere? Not how do you add more technology, because seen from a overall perspective, it's just taking away resources from one part of the Earth system and putting them in the other. So if we are serious about transformation of the Earth system through technology, I think that we should start thinking of complete cycles. Not in the sense of the very quick closing the circles of the circular economy, where you recycle the capital and you recycle the materials at the same time and at the same speed. But understanding that cycles are operating at completely incoherent levels of temporality. I think that's the most difficult part in terms of the scientific relationship at the moment.
I recently read a theory by a philosopher, and he was basically talking about a sensorial notion and what senses mean to humans. So he was asked, why don't people go meatless? He was just asked a question, why don't people go meatless? And to that he said that because the vegan industry does not really appeal sensorially to people who have been consuming meat for years and years and years. And there was this second idea that we all know about, that the 1%, the top 1% only try to or act or do something or invest in climate peace when it affects them directly. So I question this sort of dry and individualistic materialism that we humans, most humans possess. And how do we question that and how we get away from that?
But the 1% wants to go to Mars.
Yeah.
They don't want climate peace, they want to go to Mars. The same guy as the Cybertruck wants to go to Mars. So I don't think that there's any interesting level in thinking that the billionaires paying for preservation of the ocean or reinstatement of the forest. It's quite interesting what's going on with the entire diatribe around the reforestation of the Amazon. I don't know if you're following that relationship, no? But this is the beginning of the beautiful treatise on perpetual peace by Immanuel Kant. The paragraph after this, it's about practical people, in particular practical politicians, looking down at those who come up with ideas. The philosophers. You're talking, but actually there's a practice there that needs to be imposed. And the entire treatise, the entire little beautiful essay is trying to mock that distinction. It's game against those who think of practice and those who theory, and trying to retangle them. So there's still something interesting in this proposition. Maybe not because of the notion of hospitality that he proposes, of global citizenship, but in the treatise I think that there is a particular set of passages around the role of secrecy, around the role of public speech, and the role in particular of people who have access to knowledge that might be worth revisiting. And we're not, of course, in the field of limited hospitality that Kant was indicating. And we know very well that the problem with Kant is the entire separation between agents and the inert structures. I think that, but I really don't think that we have to inspire people to eat vegan food. I don't think that it's about inspiring people like that. I think if we could only deal with politics without inspiration, it would be much better. No, when you are a young architect or someone who aspires to become an architect, you have that moment when you say, yeah, I'm good at maths, I'm good at this, but look, I got imagination. And that flips you to architecture because you've got imagination. And all the others look back down at you, but yeah, it's full of imagination, not real. No? But that is exactly what we need, imagination more than inspiration. I think, for me, that's really the little power that architecture and the arts still carry. And they manage, through imagination and inspiration, to gather particular groups of people and have particular discussions. Something that the art world has managed much better than the architectural world to do, and is to maintain that public level of discussion. We closed off very quickly and talked to ourselves.
I just wanted to thank you both and the students for your hospitality and your conviviality. Because there's a strange sense of loss as we approach, I guess the next stage and phase of what I hope will be a continuation of these Monday gatherings, because it's exactly that leap of imagination and, I guess, the proliferation of ideas that you've all managed to bring around the table, for me, has been incredibly powerful in terms of understanding that, for instance, when we're asked the question, and where are we to land, and you tell us we land in the sea, and if we land in the sea, then what do we see? I'm not speaking in riddles, there's actually a point to this, I think. Because what was quite intriguing in you setting up the series as, climate war, now we have, from war and peace, to then one of the images of the tar sands, we have crime, okay? And again, not to be too silly about pushing it into punishment, but perhaps understanding how it is that we might use law as leverage if we are to be practical and imaginative with the tools we already have amongst us. Then how is it that we enable these negotiations to happen in a way that brings people to the various tables you see floating? So one of those, and again, it's an open question, I wish we had the legal scholars amongst us this evening, was to see how we might use something which I've just discovered recently, because clearly law is not my field, but I'm beginning to understand that it is a point of leverage which we can start to apply pressure in very real ways, which mean financial ways. So the law of tort might be one which we need to consider as a tactical and very practical codified set of moves to bring various people around these platforms. So I'd like to know how you take these conversations forward in terms of now moving into these various rounds of negotiation, wherever they might be on whichever one of these seas, and to ensure that at this table, these various tables, that we have these more imaginative conversations with the legal scholars, with, all of these other, and even people that aren't even present, so the anthropologists, the feminist international security studies scholars which are out there, which are actually putting together quite fundamental shift in terms of how the international securities framework is put together. So I think there are even more avenues which open up from these very, very intimate discussions we have. Yeah. And, just by way of thanks, it would, well done, that's great. And I hope we can continue this.
Enjoy conviviality. There's food and grapes.
You would like a drink?